Since 1968, British police have infiltrated more than 1,000 political movements with undercover police officers. Many of those movements were not only peaceful, but advanced arguments we now see as politically common sense, whether it's advancing women's rights or opposition to apartheid. 7 years ago, Theresa May ordered an inquiry into the police's use of undercover officers relating to protest, and late last year, the Undercover Policing Inquiry finally began. Expected to run until 2023 and coming in at a cost of tens of millions of pounds, it is a judge-led inquiry on a par with the Savile and Chilcot inquiries. But will it lead to justice and change? And even if it doesn't, what are the chances that it furnishes yet further light on how the police treat and often subvert democratic dissent? Joining me now is Tom Fowler, host of the Spycops Info podcast, and so far, someone who is attending every session and providing as much live reporting as is possible from the inquiry. Tom, welcome to Downstream.
Cheers, thanks for having me.
Before we get started with the interview, I think it's going to be a really exceptionally informative interview. I want you to do two things at the end, but only if you find it useful. One is to like this video, and the other is to subscribe to the channel, but only if you find this a useful interview, which I'm almost certain you will. And if you do, please do those two things. We really appreciate it. We've got so many great interviews coming out in the next couple of weeks. Theresa May announced this was going to happen 7 years ago, yet it only happened late last year. Why did it take so long for this inquiry into undercover policing to actually happen?
Because the goddamn cops, man. What else? So, I mean, like, essentially, the police used every opportunity they could to slow down the process. Partially, that's because they put in, like, they asked for anonymity orders for each of the individual officers. The levels of secrecy, the level of anonymity these cops have had has been, well, practically unprecedented, to be honest. Obviously, they've had the documents, so there's the redaction process. So they've like dragged their heels through that. I mean, they've put in a couple of judicial reviews, which we don't know what the details of those were, but that slowed up the process as well. Just literally every opportunity the police could possibly choose to slow things down, they've taken it. I mean, it's worth noting on the anonymity thing, they've been really like keen to like kind of impress upon the chair of the inquiry that these former undercover officers would be in danger if they weren't anonymous. I mean, like, I think you'd probably be aware there's a number of former undercover officers who infiltrated like criminal groups or criminal gangs who have a public profile, have no danger whatsoever. Something like Neil Woods, one of the more noted former undercover drug cops, has come forward and said, well, this is ridiculous. I never expected any anonymity later in life. Why are these guys getting it? And certainly, you know, it's really weird that they've got so much anonymity. But that's made not just the process for getting it started really slow, but as the inquiry takes place, makes it a really alienating and difficult process to engage with.
From what I'm hearing and from what I've heard on your excellent podcasts, I'd really recommend our audience to go to straight after this, but only after this. It sounds like the opposite of accountability and transparency. Obviously, you're there, not in the flesh, you're virtually there monitoring things. How does it feel to you? Are they trying to be transparent in this inquiry so far?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I have been going there in the flesh. So in order to watch the live feed of the undercover officers give evidence, you have to go to a special viewing room, which is basically, you know, it's where the inquiry is actually taking place at the moment. As you say, a lot of it's because of COVID, but I don't expect the end of COVID will result in the beginning of any kind of transparency happening. I think the whole thing, like so many of these things, man, it's like, it's designed to be alienating. It's designed to be like off-putting to ordinary people, you know. So like, there's a whole layer of like legal bullshit, which is like quite hard to kind of, from someone like myself, to sift through in the first place. But it feels like they've done everything possible to like kind of keep as much as possible secret. So, for example, the undercover officers, they've all got anonymity for their real names, and in some cases their cover names. But they don't actually refer to them by their cover names. They refer to them by a cipher. The HN number, but then there's certain officers who've got such a level of secrecy they haven't even got a cipher assigned to them. So there've been numerous undercover officers who've been deployed into political protest groups who we can't even really. It's quite hard to talk about someone when you haven't even got a cipher to describe them. Their evidence has been put into gists, which are then mixed together with other undercover officers who've got full anonymity, so that it's really hard to like draw out where this bit of information is coming from. Obviously, as well, I mean, like typically for any sort of inquiry, you know, as soon as somebody's giving oral evidence, all the written evidence is published. So, I mean, we've gone from a real like famine to feast of information when it comes to this topic.
And what's the ambit of the inquiry rather? What's it trying to cover? What's the period? What organisations is it looking into?
So, when the inquiry, the terms of reference refer to the deployment of undercover police into protest groups from 1968, which really refers to two groups: the Special Demonstration Squad and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. The Special Demonstration Squad was set up in 1968 and ran through until the 2007, I think it was. The National Public Order Intelligence Unit was set up in 2001, ran until it was discovered, essentially, 2011. It still exists in some form, what that is, These units were deployed in up to approximately, once they got going, 4 to 5 year deployments into political protest groups. What we're discovering from the inquiry is it was almost exclusively the left. The inquiry is working in tranches, and this first tranche, which we're still on, is 1968 to 1982, and so far everybody has been infiltrated into the left. Initially, it was the anti-Vietnam War campaign. Once they they were deep enough into that, then it became the anti-apartheid movement, then the Troops Out movement, anti-fascist groups. Basically, whatever the big noise was on the left at that time. Supposedly, their issue was public disorder and sedition, but subversion. Sorry, not sedition, subversion. But you get an impression that it's neither of those things, really.
And the thing about it not really monitoring, covering what we would now call domestic extremism on the right. I mean, just for our audience out there, we're talking that the mid to late 1970s is there's a hugely emergent, powerful far right in this country, both on the streets, but also the National Front doing pretty well in elections. So, I mean, that makes that look particularly strange, doesn't it? The absence of these guys going after right-wing groups too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, as well as large numbers of protests by the National Front, they were the numbers involved are quite low, but for an overtly fascist party in Britain, they were doing incredibly well. They came fourth in a number of elections. They looked like they might take over the Liberals at one point. Thatcher really successfully stole I think we see that again more recently with the Conservative Party just borrowing from parties further to the right to bolster their electoral whatever, But yeah, in the 1970s, you had a lot of racist attacks, fire bombings, pretty serious stuff. It was really it was quite shocking when I've been hearing the evidence from these former undercover officers when it's put to them, why did you choose the International Socialist, the International Marxist Group, or Anarchy Magazine, or one of these to infiltrate when the National Front were so active? They went, oh, well, the National Front weren't a problem. And it just literally without that context of knowing what was happening at the time, you think, oh, well, they weren't being a problem then. But I think it really relates back to something we hear a lot, where whereas left-wing politics is considered unacceptable, maybe in the pay of foreign governments, and coming from some secret evil clique, fascist politics is presented as the legitimate concerns of the white working class. And you get the impression that not only comes from the top, but also comes from special branch, that the police themselves clearly didn't have a problem with the National Front, probably because they supported a lot of those things. And also when you're reading their reports, the language used in those reports, I'm not going to repeat it here because it's incredibly racial language. They're describing people, because the reports they did on people were incredibly detailed, not just what they were doing politically, but what was going on in their personal lives, where they worked, whether they were a member of a trade union, how much they earned, who they lived with, how much those people they lived with earned, what they looked like, everything about them. But often would include quite nasty sort of comments about their appearance and their race, both people of color, Jewish people, also any kind of ethnic minority was getting slagged off basically in these reports.
More than 1,000 groups were infiltrated by the undercover officers. I think you tell me more than 180 officers, I think, or something between 150, 200 officers.
Yeah, somewhere around there. So there's, as well as the field officers, there's the handlers, but then some of the backroom staff. But then some of those, we've got some officers got more than one cipher because they had more than one role. Right. Which initially you got the impression this was part of what I was saying about being so alienating is kind of confusing. That you kind of the numbers kind of move as you kind of go, well, there was this many roles, but how many actual officers there were is different again.
So of these 1,000 organizations that were infiltrated, more than 1,000, which are the ones that sort of stand out as particularly ridiculous for you? If you were trying to make the case against spycops, you're talking to somebody who says, no, this is good, it was necessary. What was just like brazenly absurd?
I was a member of a group called Eat Out Vegan Wales, where we went and reviewed takeaways and did like social gatherings in vegan friendly restaurants. And Marco Jacobs, who infiltrated my group, was a part of that. I mean, I think it's very easy. I mean, you could talk about all sorts of, kind of civic groups, essentially, and other kind of community organizations which were infiltrated by these undercover police. But I think, like, when it comes to that sort of thing, I don't really kind of get into those kind of arguments generally, because I think, but because the nature of like these deployments, of course, they infiltrated those kind of groups because they're infiltrating the lives of people. And I think it's really key to understand that they're not just infiltrating organizations, and often they're barely infiltrating the organization, they're infiltrating the lives of the people who are in those organizations. So, they're infiltrating groups like Eat Out Vegan Wales, or these perfectly reasonable groups, in the same way that they're infiltrating wedding parties and funerals and everything else that's in people's lives, because the cover is that deep. I mean, obviously, quite famously, they deceived a number of women into long-term sexual relationships and had children with some of them. The fact that they infiltrated like some community groups along the way as well it's to be expected.
We know of 4 undercover officers who had children. Is that correct?
We know 4 children. Yeah.
It wasn't just one person. It seems like this was basically given carte blanche by management. It seems this was kind of known about and wasn't really addressed.
Yeah. So I think there's when we first found, like back in 2010, 2011, when we first discovered these undercover officers, there was a narrative being spun by the Met Police that this was firstly, Mark Kennedy was a rogue officer, then his unit was a rogue unit, and then it kind of becomes more clear that actually this is systemic. This is more than just individual actions going on. We at first we thought that it dated back, kind of maybe a decade or two, but the more we learn, and with the inquiry, we're starting, because it's a linear inquiry, it's starting with 68. These things seem to go back much further and further. One of the undercover officers who had a number of sexual relationships, Rick Gibson, who we heard about, it turned out when another undercover officer was giving evidence about him, he was asked, did he know about what he'd got up to, and he said, oh yeah, that gossip was well known throughout Special Branch before I joined the unit. So those kind of activities were happening from very early on. We heard from a former undercover officer who used the cover name Graham Coates, who said that the language being used, the banter, the safe house banter that was going on between the undercover officers would have been considered extreme misogyny, extreme sexism, even then in the 1970s. Because one of the defenses that the police lawyers keep using is we shouldn't judge the social attitudes of people at the time by today's standards. It's becoming very clear that even by the standards of the day, they were pretty extreme, even though I reject that argument entirely anyway.
I see the argument you're saying about, well, no, we should judge this by the people's lives they were infiltrating. And also, a lot of these organizations have very permeable boundaries. Anybody involved in activism knows that you're kind of just friends with one person. You might go to some demos or one action once, and all of a sudden you're a member of X. Often doesn't, especially direct action related stuff. But I think for our audience, women's liberation, anti-apartheid, it does feel like the British state was systematically infiltrating forces for progress. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And okay, and people might have misgivings. The Socialist Workers' Party, that's a revolutionary party which ultimately wants political power. Okay, fine. And some people are, I don't even like the idea of that. Fine, but anti-apartheid, the anti-Nazi League. I mean, it sounds really astonishing. Within the police themselves, was there never a sort of political tension there? Is there any suggestion, at least, that some people at the top were saying, look, we had a war with these guys in the 30s and the 40s, the Nazis. Now we're monitoring people and infiltrating people, calling themselves the anti-Nazi League. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. So how was the politics of that all decided? Was it coming from the Home Secretary? Was it kind of autonomous? What was it?
I certainly don't get any impression there being any kind of political tension around this. It's very clear that it went all the way to Home Secretary, absolutely. The the annual reports that were submitted were to renew the funding. Made it very clear it went all the way to the top. But yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right. It was, I personally believe that the whole thing was about fighting social attitudes, right? It's not just about disorder. It's not about anything else. It's about holding back those social attitudes. I mean, so like one of the groups was infiltrated and broken up essentially by the deployment of undercover police. The undercover officer, was central in the expulsion of many of the main activists. Was the Women's Liberation Front. And I mean, when they were formed, women weren't allowed to open their own bank accounts in the UK. There's this idea now, particularly that anti-apartheid, like these days, everybody was against apartheid, right? Well, no, they bloody weren't. And the government of the day certainly bloody wasn't. And, remember at the time when the anti-apartheid movement was active in the early 70s, BOSS, the security services from South Africa were, planting bombs across London and, getting involved in all sorts of really heavy duty shit. And the anti-apartheid movement were getting their jumble sales infiltrated. That whereas we might think that that everybody in British politics would be against the Nazis, against the apartheid. Well, no, they're not, and no, they weren't. And foresight's a wonderful thing, and the reality is that it served the interests of the British establishment for the rise of things like the National Front as a counterbalance to left-wing ideas and left-wing populism.
Assessing this stuff, the best way to look at it is imagine what Britain would have been like if these guys hadn't infiltrated more than 1,000 organizations, if they hadn't deployed into this and that organization, how much further along we would be in terms of social progress. I think that's such a powerful argument. And that it doesn't really feel like there's a pushback because, at least when you have undercover policing with drug stings or counterterrorism, with actual terrorist organizations who've committed, quite serious things. People can agree or disagree about, civil liberties being curtailed and so on and so forth. But people can demonstrate and say, look, if we don't do this, this happens. But I can't really see it. There was no downside if they hadn't done this. There was only upside. Is that a fair assessment?
So initially, the unit is supposedly set up as a response to the anti-Vietnam War demonstration May 1968 outside the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square, which the police lost control of. And there's, the initial argument is that we needed that intelligence in order to be able to meet the challenges of public disorder. So there's the idea that we were wasting police resources by over-policing certain demonstrations and putting police at danger by under-policing other demonstrations. I don't buy that at all. I mean, largely because you could get that kind of information without infiltrating these groups to that level. But certainly, once you get beyond the early days of the unit, it's obvious that their agenda is much wider than that. And yeah, like they're holding back these organizations, not just by like infiltrating them and like reporting on them, but by, in many cases, taking the roles that would have gone to like activists who are very, competent and articulate and know what they're doing, taking those roles, getting elected into positions. And as they bragged themselves at the inquiry, didn't do much, didn't do anything, didn't do any of the work though. I wasn't working for those I was infiltrating. I just took the position and didn't do very much. So I mean, if you take, like, for example, Rick Gibson, who infiltrated the Troops Out movement. He actually contacted, because where he was deployed, there was no local branch. He had to contact the national organizers and say, I want to start a branch in my area. He became the rep for that branch. He ended up being the rep for London. He ended up being on the national committee. And for a while, he was national coordinator of the Troops Out movement. So they're taking in some cases, like the key role inside an organization. There's no doubt in my mind that that not only would the Troops Out movement have been more effective, but perhaps, that the message that they were giving, which was that we didn't want to have a military deployment in Northern Ireland, aside from any kind of concerns about what Irish republicanism means or didn't, but that there shouldn't be soldiers on the streets, would have got a lot further, right? If there wasn't an undercover cop running the organization that's making this argument. And more than that as well, I think one of the key things which the undercover cops used was trauma. In a number of ways. They used trauma as part of their deployment, a part of their legend, but also they used trauma for how they interacted with the group and how they've ultimately left. And that use of trauma often left its mark on people, many of which, didn't get involved in politics as much or in activism as much going forward as maybe they would have otherwise. And I think the use of undercover police into activist groups really stunted not just those groups, but the people involved with them from doing that kind of activism again in the future. And I think, to my way of thinking, there's too many amazing, inspiring activists that I know have spent decades of their lives firstly trying to piece together what really happened, but also dealing with the trauma or the supporting somebody who's supposedly gone through trauma, because so many of these undercover officers would tell a story of their own personal trauma, which would then make people want to look after them.
Can you just provide one example of an officer and perhaps their legend and the kinds of ways they manipulated those around them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was what was really common. So someone like Andy Davey, who we know as Andy Coles. He's the brother of the Reverend Richard Coles. He's currently a councillor in Peterborough. Up until not long ago, he was the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for Peterborough. He was an undercover police officer in the early 1980s, the mid 1980s, in animal rights groups in London. He claimed that his parents both died, that he was adopted, that he'd been in care. He was fostered. He'd been in care. And he made connections with people who had similar stories. During his deployment, he gave a lot of. It's really difficult for me to talk about a lot of this, because so much of this is about these stories is personal information which people who've been traumatized by undercover police have told to me. Some of it's in the public domain, some of it's not. So I'm always really wary of talking about a lot of this, because though it might be in the public domain, I could easily get it confused. But essentially, it's a pattern we see across these undercover officers. So many of them had these stories of trauma. Often they would come out. For example, Marco Jacobs, who infiltrated the group I was in, he claimed he'd been a victim of domestic violence in his previous long-term relationship, which was something which he didn't really want to tell people about, because he was a proper bloke and this woman had knocked him around a lot, and it had really affected his confidence, and he had problems around that. When Mark Kennedy was discovered as being having a fake passport and stuff, he came out with this hugely complex cock and bull story, which involved him, staying up all night crying in the arms of the woman he was infiltrating, telling this ridiculous story of horrible trauma, things which really stuck with people for a long time. There's so many examples of it, and so similar as well. And that's one of the other things, is that so many of these officers' stories were so similar, and it would appear. I mean, we look at something like the Tradecraft Manual, which really kind of set out the sort of the way in which to behave around what they called wearies, which was and actual activists who they found wearisome to deal with, because they would talk politics to them and stuff. The tips and tricks that they were being given, they obviously used, and so much of it's redacted. We don't know what's in it, but drawing from what we can read, you get the impression of people being incredibly manipulative of people's emotions, not just in a way to for their deployment and for their legend, to make their job easier, but also just to kind of twist the knife a bit, basically, particularly when we see the withdrawals, because often these men were in what to the women they were in relationships with, incredibly loving relationships. These men were like the perfect men for them in some way, because they had so much information about their target that they could present themselves as the perfect boyfriend. And then when they did disappear, they would, concoct this story that was, that was so traumatic that it would kind of made sense why they disappeared, but meant that left these women wanting to search them, being very worried about them for some kind of cases, decades on end.
Of course. I mean, there's no other word for it. I mean, I find it evil. And I think also, this was a job where the absolute worst elements of kind of, people talk about toxic masculinity, but kind of narcissistic, lying, deception, maybe prone to physical violence. And the state is saying to these men who are, they're basically saying, look, unleash this sort of inner psychopath in you, if you will, do all these things that you could never normally do, in your everyday life. And what's more, the public story for it's going to be, you're keeping people safe doing it. And I find it astonishing. And of course, there was a public campaign to talk about getting spy cops, ending the whole practice. And it was raised most memorably, of course, by Lush. And there was a huge public kickback to that. I mean, when that campaign happened, were you surprised that the sort of overt political nature of the campaign? Of course, Lush have been involved in these things, but they really took it on. And were you also surprised at the level of sort of public pushback? The fact that people are willing to defend the police having children with women and effectively sexually assaulting them and then leaving their lives forever.
Basically, right, we had some, like, they kind of met with us and were like, what can we do to help? And we're like, we should do a campaign. And we're like, in the window campaign, come on, you should do that. Because they'd given some funding, some various groups. They'd given some funding to Police Spies Out of Lives around before that time. And we were like, we went to a window campaign and we were like, yeah, great, do that. And they asked us some advice and we were like, yeah, do this, do that, whatever. And then I'll be honest, I didn't think it was anybody was going to fucking notice much, to be honest. I mean, I've been involved in other things that had like a Lush window campaign and it hasn't resulted in a great deal, to be perfectly frank. You kind of get a little bit of added interest, but like it doesn't really amount to a whole hill of beans. But like, fucking hell, that was a big deal, wasn't it, eh? I mean, like, fucking hell. Yeah, I was in work and I've got things turned off in work with them. But I looked on my lunch break, I looked at my phone and was like, oh shit, what's going on? Yeah, I'm always surprised by people. I mean, I think partially it's my own background. I'm from South Wales. I grew up in the 80s. Like the police were a occupational army around here at one point. I was most people I know ain't got much time for the cops. I'm always shocked that people like support the police. It seems regardless of what they do. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That whole sort of thing of like the push, like the push for the king. It's like even the bloody Home Secretary had to go about it, didn't he? I mean, like, yeah, woe betide you criticize the police on like some really serious matter, and like can hold them to account for it, because apparently then you're undermining all policing. I don't know, man. Like it really. I'm not one to like kind of have a reasoned argument with people like that. I mean, I just fuck the police, man. Fuck off. Like,
for me, I thought it kind of reflected a certain desperation in a way, because it's like it was just so transparently obvious that they were in the wrong. And like you said, there's probably 25% of society who will defend the police whatever they do, and most of them vote Tory. And it did feel like an act of desperation. But speaking about that, actually, you got Theresa May in all of this, who of course was a Tory Home Secretary, who is the one that's basically started this inquiry. We'll maybe talk about that briefly in a moment, about whether or not you think it'll go anywhere. But it's still a judge-led inquiry into the police, started by a Conservative Home Secretary, who's actually, she's not exactly on the, she was not on the centre of the party on things like immigration and so on. So how can we understand this? How do we make sense of the fact that Theresa May is the one who gave us an inquiry into undercover policing?
Fuck knows, man. To be honest with you, like, people always ask me what surprises you most about this process, and like once you've got over the initial thing, right? Like, it's hard to be. I mean, I'm shocked but not surprised all the time. But I was bloody surprised that she did that. I mean, I think like it shows. I mean, partially it was because of the infiltration of the Lawrence family. The Justice for Stephen Lawrence campaign, and the political capital that like that has in this country. Just about is one of the few kind of progressive, like, anti-racist things that has some sort of political capital in this country for reasons I don't really understand. I got the impression, maybe people who understand these things better than me might have a different view, but I got the impression that like Theresa wanted to like save a few quid. It was like, for good neoliberal reasons, the cops cost too much, and she was trying to cut them down to size. And there was a few things. Didn't you do like a couple of inquiries at that point? And like the Daniel Morgan independent inquiry, maybe a panel, was that same sort of time? So I think there was other battles going on, and this was just a way of like, because I remember she get booed at the like police federation that year. Yeah. Like for whatever reason, she was having a pop at the cops. And like, I'm no fan whatsoever. Absolutely none at all. But like, fair play to her for pulling this one. I don't know why she did, really. I think it's great that she did, but like, I don't know why. And I couldn't give you any insight why.
I mean, my theory with Theresa May is I think it's partly neoliberalism, but I also think like the Tories, a lot of Tories, obviously Priti Patel would never do what Theresa May did, but I think they think like, we're the elected government, we're the ones that should be making these political choices. And the reality is that the Metropolitan Police Service, the police generally in this country, Scotland Yard, New Scotland Yard now, genuinely think like they aren't answerable to anybody. I mean, of course, the political leadership is answerable to the Home Secretary in regards to certain things, but I think they view themselves as autonomous. And the second you sort of say, well, hold on, actually, formally, that's not the case, they get really shirty. And I think that's where that conflict came from. I think just reversing for a second, I mean, this is something you talked about, I think, in one of the podcasts as well. And this blew my mind. This blew my mind, Tom, which was that Peter Hain in 2003 was, and maybe you can tell me who said this in the police. Peter Hain, of course, was a member of the Labour cabinet under Blair. In 2003, even up to then, was still being referred to as a South African terrorist by the police. And this is when he's in government. This is what they were calling him 40 years earlier. This is somebody who's serving in Blair's government. So you think, Christ, if a Labour, and he's now in the House of Lords, if a Labour minister is a terrorist for these people, God help the rest of us. Can you sort of illuminate that anecdote a bit? Do we have any idea who said this and why they said it? I mean, that's a bit more explicable, perhaps.
It was a report from Mark Kennedy, who was deceived Kate Wilson into a sexual relationship at the time. Kate Wilson's family, Kate Wilson went to school with Peter Hain's kids. The family were friendly with Peter Hain, and he'd been at some, I think it was over Christmas, it was some family, some like Christmassy gathering that he was at. And it was in Mark Kennedy's report from that the noted South African terrorist was there, Yeah, I mean, I think it really just shows you like kind of how deep the hole is. That, though you might have a different government at some time, it's still the Tory state, man. The UK is the Tory state. They own the state. Like, it doesn't matter if they're not the government, they're still the fucking state. And like, and I'm sure, like people like, you can join the establishment if you like, kiss enough boots and kiss enough asses and do all the right things. But like, you're never fully like you're still, like tough, like you're still scum to them, really. And I think it just illustrates that. I mean, we haven't found any, every political party in the UK was infiltrated except for the Conservative Party. And, that kind of says it all, really.
That's another thing. Yeah, I mean, following up from the Peter Hain point, these guys infiltrated the Young Liberals, parts of the Labour, but the Young Liberals, man.
Yeah. Well, the Young Liberals were like opposing apartheid. So obviously, I mean, like it was important for the British state to, give their due support to their ally in South Africa and to stamp out the campaign against what was internal South African politics, right? I mean, like, literally, like we can. It's not a complicated answer. It's the obvious answer. They were like, yeah, we might think of them as quite mild, but like they were opposed to what was the law of the day. So like they were a problem.
So final question here, this to me sums up British politics and British public life. On the one hand, we've got an inquiry into undercover policing. And at the exact same time, we've got, a bill proceeding through Parliament. Both parties ostensibly were backing it. That's sort of changed. Basically legalizing a bunch of practices, codifying in law rather than just sort of letting things pass. A lot of the practices that we've been talking about today that you'll be covering over the next couple of months and years, indeed, with this inquiry. Again, how do you make sense of that tension? There's a judge-led inquiry into a set of behaviours, and at the exact same time, they're being legalised by the Conservative Party, and almost the Labour Party got behind it. Ultimately, it became too politically costly. How do we make sense of that? It just seems so chaotic, and I don't know. It's just kind of like volatile and doesn't make any sense to me. Can you make sense of it for me, Tom? Can you help me understand it?
If you're playing the game, right, and you're following the rules and you're kind of like doing it in the right order or whatever, no, it doesn't make any sense. But like, since when do the Boris Johnsons of this world, or like does the Tory party in general give a shit about that, man? It's like, it was an ideal opportunity. They won some case at the IPT, some MI5 case, and there was an opportunity and they just fucking jumped, right? So they just did it, like, and actually it makes perfect sense if you think, if you like looking at it from their point of view. It's like, oh well, this could be embarrassing at some point once it finally reports in like 20 years time, whatever the bloody hell long this thing's going to take. But if we just legalize it all now, it won't be a problem. And also it means that we can carry on with all these other things that we're doing right under the noses of this inquiry, which, I mean, like, because might is right, and that's all that politics means.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely a relationship between these two things. And I think ultimately, yeah, when the inquiry reaches its conclusions, well, it's all legal now, so no more inquiries needed. Tom, if our audience wants to know where to find you and to follow your work, where do they need to go?
You can find me on Twitter at Tom B. Fowler. If you want to check out the podcast or anything else, I've got links to everything. Spycops.info. It's all there.
If you've enjoyed this interview, like I said at the start, there's two things you can do. Don't cost you a thing. We really appreciate it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. If you want to see more content like this, and I think we have to get Tom back on to talk about this important topic, go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. My name's Aaron Bastani. You've been watching Downstream. Michael Walker is back tomorrow night with Tisky Sour. But from me, from our producers, and I presume from Tom too, good night.